Well, welcome to the Afterword, here with Steve Clifford.
Hello.
Okay, so I'm so excited about this because the topic perfectly aligns with one of your great strengths, which is Jesus talking about what it means to be great.
Oh.
And so this is something I know that you've thought a lot about, and I know that you've taught a lot about, but I wanted to get into this because I think every person has this question. So there's this moment when the disciples come up to Jesus, and it's hard to not to isolate this in the middle of the narrative, but so much has happened. Like in the story, first they have this, Jesus says like, hey, who do the people say I am? And then he asks them, who do you say I am? And there's this Messiah revelation that Peter says, you're the Messiah. And Jesus affirms that. But then he tells them, I'm going to die on a cross. And that doesn't make any sense to them.
Yeah.
And so in the middle of that, there's this, and then there's the transfiguration, which is this, hey, listen, if you doubted what I said about the Messiah thing, I'm going to show, and not everyone gets to see that. So Peter, James, and John get to see that, but the other disciples kind of don't, and they had to have talked about it. Peter, James, and John must have been out of their minds excited. And so then, I don't know why they asked the question, but they begin asking the question, hey, who's the greatest in the kingdom? I don't know if they're asking that because they're saying, are Peter, James, and John, are they up there and we're not? Or
And it's interesting because if you take the context of Mark 9, which parallels with this, they're arguing about it.
Right.
So before they ever involve Jesus in this discussion, they're spending a lot of time. And Peter, James, and John, they got the trump card.
Yeah. Hey,
they got the trump card. It's pretty much between those three because,
hey, we got to go up to the mountain.
We saw Moses, dude.
Yeah, we saw Elijah.
We saw him.
Yeah. We're his favorites.
Looked like the most amazing Mr. Clean he's ever been.
Right. Glowing, brilliant white lightning. So they're asking the question, but what I started thinking about this because these are all cast-offs. All his disciples were from low status. They were fishermen, tax collectors. They had been rejected from the formal rabbinical training. They were not rabbis. They were not considered rabbi material. That's why they were applying their parents' trade, their father's trade. There must have been a sense of, man, we are with this rock star. They know who Jesus is. And there's rock star. I mean, there's thousands of people coming. This is a movement, right? And so there's an excitement. If I was chosen, that must mean something. Like I'm with a rock star now. There's a sense of this. They also live in a high honor culture where I think every human must live in some sort of sense of honor culture. The idea of like, what does it mean to be prestigious? I want the acclaim and the respect of my fellow citizens, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think you either live in the pursuit of honor or the avoidance of shame.
Sure.
One of those two.
Sure. Well, we'll get to that in a second. Okay. But because there's so much interesting there. And then they basically are told, actually, so they're asking this question, like, are we, like, what's going on? Who's great in the, how do you measure greatness, Jesus? And so I thought it was really interesting because his answer must have been very difficult for them to stomach. Because they must have been like, hey, listen, we've arrived. We're with Jesus, the rock star.
Yeah. Like,
there's something good here. So, just kind of unpack the context around the question and then maybe how the disciples might have responded or how we might respond. And then we'll get to what Jesus, I think, is trying to teach us today.
Well, I think that this is a passage that if you take it in isolation, I've heard it taught where when he's, hey, who's the greatest? And he says, come here. He calls a child over, which is interesting. That means children are probably normally in the presence. The throng of people that are following Christ as he travels
includes children,
includes women and children.
Yeah.
Well, we know it includes women, and if it included women, that means they brought their kids because there was no childcare to leave them with, right? And so the kids are there. He calls a child to them, and he says, if you want to be greatest, you got to be like a child. And I've heard this taught about, well, what's a child like? Well, they're captivated and easily curious and laugh and all those beautiful things. But that is not what they would have heard. You have to understand, he just took, this is lower than a slave. A child is lower than a slave in
terms of worth
in Roman culture.
In Roman culture, in terms of worth, right?
In first century Roman culture, they have zero rights. At least there are some rights for a slave. I mean, there's some protections for a slave, but there are zero. I mean, I talked about this, and Jay did as well, that there were like there's almost a 2-week period when a child is born when a father has complete say over whether this child lives or dies. And it's commonplace that they die. Mm-hmm. If it's the sex, if it's a wrong gender,
right,
they discard it. If it has any defect or didn't come out with blue eyes, I mean, they don't need to justify the reason at all. All they need to say is there's actually a ritual where they would lay the child on the floor before the father. If the father does not pick up the child and he walks away, then the child is discarded. In fact, one of the primary ministries of the early Christian church was to the saving of the lives of these children that were discarded.
Right. From what I understand, they just go up in the hills and lay the child out
or
for exposure.
Go to the garbage pile and lay them on the garbage pile.
And so Christians would hear the cries of these abandoned children, and then
they would respond.
Kind of the first orphanage.
My point is that we when we hear "be like a child," we think that
it's cute and sweet and
happy-go-lucky,
get your crayons and your paste.
Yeah,
right.
But that's not what they would have heard.
Yeah.
They would have heard what he says other times. Basically, you have to lay aside this life of following Christ is a death to self.
Yeah.
And it's more than that. So there's joy and meaning and purpose and all those kinds of things. But it is this, he who is the greatest really is the least.
Right.
And it would have been a difficult thing for them to hear.
So he says, unless you change, so I think that's the first interesting phrase, become like children, and whoever takes this lowly position.
Yeah.
So it seems like there are two aspects there. The first is the view of oneself, which is your own self-estimate shows kind of how you relate to those in lowly position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so there's the first part. So let's talk about that. There's a humility that's not just nice to have; it's kind of demanded. So he's trying to get the disciples to see themselves in a certain way, and it's
demanded. I don't know if I would say it that way, but it's clearly modeled.
Okay.
I mean, think about the great hymn of the first century church is Philippians chapter 2, that being in very nature God, being God, laid aside all of that glory, all of the things that he had experienced for eternity past,
to become a servant, a slave, yeah,
and then to subject himself to the cruelty of Roman guards and the pettiness of all of the religious leaders of the day, and then the bickering amongst his own best friends. Yeah. About who's great. And I mean, when you think about what he modeled for us, Mark 10:45, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. I think that this passage is just this giant marker that, guys, you don't get it yet, but you're going to get it. And the kingdom, and we don't get it.
Yeah.
And as Americans, we don't get it.
Right.
There are some places where humility actually flows out of people quite nicely. I think about my time in Uganda. Ugandan people are very happy. I love Uganda. And one of the reasons is because they're actually way more humble than most of the people and me.
Yeah, and more communal as a society. Yeah.
Yeah.
So so let's get into that, because I was thinking about the honor and shame. The disciples lived in this society that valued honor, the social approval of your group or others. Yeah. That was like the highest good, and it was bestowed to individuals sometimes because of their position. Sure. You're a king, or you're a priest, or you're a father, like you said. But others had to acquire it by working really hard and becoming famous or wealthy, that kind of thing. And that doesn't seem too different than the Bay Area. There's a lot. There's a lot of things going on that are honor culture. Your zip code, what kind of car you drive, what kind of position you have, stock options, Mostly in the Bay, it's around wealth and how the company and how it's doing, that kind of thing. So what does this verse mean for ambition in the Bay Area for people? Because you've seen that there's a lot of ambitious people in the Bay Area, men and women who are really gifted, really skilled. And there's kind of if you look at it, the Silicon Valley kind of has this idea of the great person, or they call it the great man, but it mean man or woman. The great man, there's this idea that great people kind of arise and they lead great companies and they make tons of money and they're important, Yeah. That's kind of the mythos, of the
but
Bay.
I think you can do all of those things. You can lead great companies and actually accumulate great wealth and still be humble. That is a possibility.
So what does that mean for ambition? What does this mean for the Bay Area, for people who are listening, who are followers of Jesus, who
I even think you can pursue and be very ambitious and still be humble. Humble is, to me, it's a sense of, Romans 12:3, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourselves with a sound judgment in accordance with the measure of faith or grace that God has given you. So I think you can have titles and sit in the C-suite and at a very successful level and still think correctly of yourself. Those titles, that level of wealth doesn't make you better than other people. Mm-hmm. And when you begin to think that because you drive a certain car or live in a certain zip code or make a certain amount of money, that makes you better than others, and you look down on them, that is anathema to Jesus' teaching.
Yeah.
That would be contrary in every way.
Which goes into the second part of Jesus' definition. He says you have to have this, you have to become like children. And then he says you got to welcome these. There's a second aspect of this command. You got to welcome those of lowly position as well.
Yeah, he actually changes terms, and he begins to talk about little ones.
Or lowly ones.
Instead of children. Child.
Yeah.
And
he's making a tie or something.
And because he says these little ones that believe in me, I think he actually switches the emphasis back towards the disciples. Mm-hmm. And as they've been bickering about trying to one up each other, he's saying, that's exactly wrong. Be like this child in that you take a humble position. And then all the warnings of gouging your eye out or cutting your arm off or your hand off, those are ones that if you move against the kingdom of God and cause these folks here to stumble, I think he actually changes his attention somehow.
Sure.
And it's quite amazing there. So I think that to equate wealth with pride, I think would be wrong. Although Jesus taught that it usually goes hand in hand.
It can, right. It can corrupt. Wealth can corrupt that way.
But I think it's not. It is to adopt a position where you place others above yourself, and you place others in a situation where you're considering them more important than yourself.
Right.
And you can do that with a lot of money or very little.
So even
it's more difficult with a lot of money.
Well, even if you have a lot of power or a lot of money, there's going to be a temptation to think, think about, I thought about Taylor Swift and her concert. Mm-hmm. I imagine on that tour.
That's something I've never done.
Well, she was on tour for months and months and months. She must have had people at every aspect of her life. I wonder what she did alone. Like, did she sleep? Probably sleep and then maybe go to the bathroom. Maybe. It's like food, exercise, outfits, clothing, hair, makeup. Driving every second of every day. There is a cavalcade of human beings tending to her every need. That does something to it. It's got to do something to a person.
It makes it very difficult to think of yourselves lowly or even accurately.
Right, exactly. So
I don't know whether she does.
I don't know either. But my point is that in the middle of that, there's this. That I guess the invitation of Jesus would be, hey, just have the proper perspective of yourself and others.
Taylor Swift is an extreme, but think about this. Imagine a world where you're in a protective shelter. You never have to worry about having a place to stay. And inside of that protective shelter, you have everything you need for the coming week. And then you have the ability to be able to exercise your gifts in ways and your intellect in such a way to earn incomes that puts you in a situation where you're richer than 95% of the world. Mm-hmm. that is who was ever listening now.
Yeah.
That's who we are. And so in that instance, where's God in the equation? You know, and it's very easy for Taylor Swift to think she's something set apart.
Yeah.
It's also very easy for us to think we don't need God.
Yeah.
We don't need him. And the truth is our next breath is a gift from him.
Is there an element with when he says the lowly ones, is there an element, it seems like another thing that leaks out is not just humility, but dependence? Which is a form of
Absolutely.
humility, I suppose.
Which is an accurate. If I just said my next breath is a gift from God, that's a lowly position. I recognize,
but it's an accurate one. You're saying it's like you said,
accurate.
Romans, like seeing yourself clearly.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to go back to something we talked about earlier, and that is the tie between Matthew and Mark, Mark 9, because Mark tells the story differently. He includes some details that Matthew's not really interested in, that just hardly anything from Mark actually survives Matthew's editing, right? And I wanted to read Mark because I think it can illuminate there's some elements of it I thought were interesting. So in Matthew it says, at that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked him, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And then he called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes this lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and anyone who welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. Mark gives some different details. They left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. Fascinating. So he's in an intensive teaching training here.
He's in prep mode for Jerusalem.
Right. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. So he's prepping them for this death of the Messiah. But they did not understand what he meant, and they were afraid to ask him about it. Because I think this is just upside down. Then they came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, they asked him, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the road? So they're back there, and they were quiet because on the way, I love that. They were quiet because they know that they're busted. They were quiet because on the way they had argued about who was greatest, like I think among them. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, look, anyone who wants to be first must be last and must be the servant of all. And then he took a little child whom he placed among them, taking the child in his arms. I don't know if that means like he's holding like an infant or if he's like, I'm unsure about the phrasing, but he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. And then later on in the very next chapter, which you kind of alluded to, James and John come to him. This is the very next chapter.
Yeah, I know.
And they come to him and they say, hey, can we have the seats on the left and the right? And he does another instruction about he's like, first of all, I can't give those seats. And second, and he says, you have seen, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and with their high officials exercise authority. Not so with you. Whoever wants to become great must be the servant. Whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. Yeah. And then he does this thing which you alluded to in Philippians. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So it feels like Mark is actually tying this, I think, pretty explicitly. Matthew's doing it too, but in his own way.
Right.
But maybe but that was really helpful for me because the idea of a little child or being like a little child might be opaque, but it's the same message, which is...
And that's why when you take this passage and you think you do all the cute stuff about children, you really missed it.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Because the context screams to you, I'm trying to tell you, I'm going to die and you're going to die. And in order for this thing to really, the message to propagate itself, it's going to be a message of humility.
Right.
And you're not going to be like a ruler. If you think there's prestige and power coming your way with the Romans because of hanging out with me, you have got it all wrong.
And they must have kind of thought that. I mean,
they had to have.
Right. Peter and these guys.
Listen, when Peter said, "We think you're the Christ,"
right?
That's
the anointed king.
Name. That's a title.
Yeah.
That's an elevated position of a king who would come from heaven and slay all of Israel's enemies and make the world right and set things right and set things in order. And they're thinking,
well, I'm with this guy.
Later on, they're arguing about where they're going to sit. This is going to be great.
Yeah.
And instead, what's going to actually happen is the church will grow in the blood spilled in the soil of the martyrs. You're going to die for this cause.
11 of the 12 just die. They get killed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they all die.
Well, would John? Only John
11
escapes violent death at the hands of this.
Yeah.
One of the things that was helpful about this on the way over, I was thinking about this. I'm in my 20s. I'm trying to figure out like life, and there was a sermon. It happened to be Black History Month, so I listened to all of Martin Luther King's recorded sermons, and there was this one. It's called the Drum Major Instinct. It was given about 2 months before he's killed. So it's in 1968. And he's talking about the drum major instinct. And he says there is something inside each human. I'll play a little clip sometime. If I find it, I'll try to give it. He said there's something inside every human that wants to be great. They want to be the drum major at the front of the parade, right? And get all the attention. And he said this can be really destructive and cause people to do all sorts of icky things with money or wealth. Or he even gets into the race dynamic. We're better because we're white or whatever it might be, or we're better because we're American, that kind of thing. And he's like, but there's actually, when Jesus actually in Mark 10 later on, when he addresses James and John and Peter and the disciples, he's like, hey, look, it's not that that's bad. You just got to use it in the right way. And he says, you want to be first? Be first in love. Be first in moral excellence. Be first in holiness. Be first in generosity and service. Yeah. And then he says at the end, I think he's reflecting. He's like, if I'm at my funeral, I wanted to be said, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace, a drum major for righteousness. All the other shallow things, they don't matter. He's like, don't talk about my Nobel Prize. That's not going to matter. Say that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. Yeah. I think that's what he's trying to get at. He's trying to say, and he's Mark 9, Jesus, all these things. He's saying, look, if you're going to be great, there's a new definition of greatness. Jesus redefines greatness in this moment.
All upside down.
So now let's get practical. If that's the new definition,
but before we get practical about that,
okay.
He doesn't stop there, and that's one of the beautiful things is that because you got to be sitting there listening to this, and if you get it, which they don't, but if you get it, you're like, oh my gosh, how in the world could I do this? Well, he says, well, there's a resource in heaven you may not be unaware of, and there's an angel watching out for you. There are angels that accompany your activity and actually help, and as you goof up along the way, the Father will always pursue you and try to bring you back. I mean, I just got goosebumps thinking about God's commitment to me to give me the resources of heaven to live the life he's now calling me to, which is a life of service, which is way hard. And then he's saying, and you're going to make mistakes, and don't worry, I'll help you get back. I will pursue you and bring you back into the fold. And he's actually happy about that whole process.
Yeah.
It brings him joy.
Well, we're going to see that later with Peter, isn't it? He's going to goof up pretty bad. And Jesus is like himself going to bring him back in. Yeah. Say, hey, you're going to do you love me?
Yeah. So anyway, you're going to see that. This call to lowliness is so countercultural to us that if we're honest, we're like,
no, thanks.
I'm going to try that, but probably not going to do very good at it. And you're right. You're not. You're going to suck at it. Mm-hmm. Some will do better than others, but most of us will suck. And because that is the hardwire of pride and sin in our life and in our flesh. But God is actually in the teachings there. It's but fear not. The resources of heaven are there at your disposal, and I will never leave you. I will always come and get you. Even though you leave me, I'll go get you. Yeah. I'll leave the 99.
That's really,
and I will
really
go
encouraging.
get you. And man, that is just so encouraging to me because I find myself, as I get older, I pursue humility better. I mean, the process of aging helps me understand that outwardly I'm wasting away, right? And so in that, but I still get it so wrong, just so wrong all the time. I get so goofed up that I'm even proud of my humility, right? Oh, I was really good there. I served them there. No, you didn't. You were just trying to impress people. I mean, the motives behind some things, and even when I get it so wrong, the Father is still pursuing me and promising to leave the 99 and go and get me, and also to give the resources of heaven to help me out.
Yeah, it's super encouraging. I wanted to ask you also about, just as we close, just practical stuff, because there's a lot of folks listening who are in various positions. Sometimes they're high ranking, sometimes they're not. But like, what does it look like? How have you've talked to and taught dozens and dozens of people. You've been doing this for years and years. You've seen examples of people who tried to do this really well and are successful. They have what are some characteristics of people who do this well, who make this turn, who kind of, because it feels a little bit like laying your life down in front of Jesus. It feels a lot like that. So what are some characteristics of what it looks like to do this well? What are some characteristics of what it looks like, what it doesn't look like, what to do, what not to do, not prescriptive necessarily, but general things that you've seen.
Yeah. I got two really good friends. One is named Tom and one is named John. And I think of them when I see humility done well. Tom pursues you and seeks out. And when I talk to him, he's always talking about who he's met, not what he's done. He talks to me about what he's shared, not how well it went. Like, there's a lot of people who would talk to me about their message, and when I talk to preachers, but then what they don't do is they don't tell me about the people they spoke with. They tell me about the message they delivered. Tom's not that way. And in some way, I think that I think underneath, he probably cares less about what people think of him than most people I know. And I think there's something there in terms of getting it right.
So what I hear you saying is, like, he's really focused on being present and interested in the people around him.
Others, yeah.
So he's thinking, who has God brought into my life, and how might I help or encourage or whatever it might mean?
Yeah, and John, my good friend John,
okay, on
the other hand, when he's with me, he bombards me with questions about me.
So he's interested in you.
Yeah. It's not an opportunity and I don't do this well. Typically, when you're talking to me, I'm thinking about what I'm going to say next, and I stop listening to you. But you can tell that John listens to me. And
so being a good listener is a form of humility.
Listener, and his conversation is directed towards the other.
Yeah.
Now, certainly he has conversations where he talks about himself, and he's vulnerable in those ways, but he constantly, it's a bombarding of these questions. There's no BS with John.
Right.
He just will cut through all of the bull and say, let's get to it a little bit. How's your heart really doing? And what did you feel there? And how are you thinking? And I think there's a couple of guys in my life that constantly challenge me in terms of what it means to be humble. Their focus is off of themselves and on others. And truth is, I don't do that very good. Even in conversations even when I preach, there are times, and you've experienced this too, where I'm not thinking about the people who are listening. I'm thinking about how well I'm delivering it, and how this is going to be heard, and who's going to like me, and it's just crap. It's anything but what Jesus is trying to teach us in Matthew.
Are there warning bells or warning signs that you've seen crop up that are like warnings of the anti-this? So when I see this in myself, this is a warning sign I'm not doing what Jesus is inviting me into.
Yeah, there's an irritability and a very quick dissatisfaction with how things are playing out when I don't get my way.
Ah, okay. That's good.
And
when you mean irritability, you mean irritability with people?
Yeah, and in a grind in myself. There's this tension in myself where I'm like, and I'm short with people. My words are not kind. I label people. I do all kinds of things.
Labeling and dismissing people, almost having
all those kinds of things.
Okay,
and it shows up.
It leaks out of you. Is what you're saying?
It leaks out of me when I don't get my way. The other thing is that when you're involved in service, and then someone treats you like a servant, and you get pissed about it, you realize you're not there to serve.
Yeah. This is especially hard with children. When I
for sure.
When I was a little while ago, I was like, I realized I was running a diner. I was like a short order cook. I was just like, and I'm just like, hey, what? I don't run a diner here, And my daughter's ordering for the dog. She's like, he'd like 2 eggs over easy. And I'm like, wait, what? This is nuts. I'm a cook for the dog. I'm a short order. Yeah. So when you're treated like a servant.
Yeah. At some point you get asked to do things that you think are below you.
Yeah.
Right. And,
well, I love what you said. You said self-preoccupation. It's really hard because I'm preoccupied with myself quite a bit. And so getting off that is good. It's not in here. Any tips or tricks on getting off yourself? Is it just worship, time with Jesus? I mean, how do you get into a lowly state? It seems like this is something we have to commit to every day. Die to yourself daily.
I think that the times when we do this best is when we're least aware of it.
Oh, okay.
And as soon as I'm starting to evaluate it in my mind, my motives become corrupted and it's no longer selfless. And so what do? You constantly hang around guys like Tom and John.
Yeah. So
you become a student of the life of Christ because he models this over and over and over and over. It
does seem like humility is one of the primary characteristics of Jesus. That it's just one of the biggest ones because it's all over. Yeah,
absolutely. So you surround yourself with those kinds of things, and then whenever you can, try to place another person's perspective and desires above yourself. Not in a way that's unhealthy or that's codependent, but in a way that just actually, how can I serve? How can I help you?
Yeah.
And you'll find that there's all kinds of opportunities to do that. If you'll just ask that question, how can I help?
Yeah.
You'll find ways that you can.
All right. Well, tough words indeed from Jesus. This is a challenging.
That's why the guardian angel little thing passage there, which I know we don't really know what that means, but it means at least that there's some resources of heaven for you to do this.
Right.
And whenever you get it wrong, the Father's not pissed off. He's pursuing you and trying to bring you back.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, thanks for this redefinition of greatness. Lots to chew on, and not just chew on, but like live out. So this is tough. So this is tough stuff, but it's the way of life, right? That's the way he says.
It is the way of life.
All right. Well, thanks, Steve, for being with us.
Thanks, man.
And we'll talk to you soon.
See ya.
All right. Bye.